Right, Altai again. Yok, as you Turks say. So I shall say a bit about Henry myself. Whether he comes or not, we'll have to see. We'll patch together today's class together from various bits. What I wanted to do to start off with, though, is carry on a bit more on medieval charters, because we didn't have as much time to go through charters and say as many of the things I wanted to say last time. So let's pick up where we left off. So if you've got the printout I gave, you can dig that out. And if you were not here, then you can have one. I've got one or two spare. Have we all got the printout then? Have we all got this? We need another one back here. Pass that back to Zainab. So I gave you this handout with 3 short ones pasted in, and here is a kind of analysis that we looked at in the class on Thursday. And for comparative purposes, so that we can see a little bit more of what they say and what they don't say and the kinds of things they say, here is another charter which I've blown up, so to speak. It's a bit later in date. The one we've got here, judging from the kinds of names I can see, is probably 12th century or something, earlier 12th century. This one is from the middle of the 13th century, so it's about 100 years or so later. But still, there are similarities and differences that we can look at. Let's read through this one first then, because we looked at this one the other day, but we'll come back to this. Know, men present and future, that I, Adam, son of Roger of Denby, have given and granted, and by this my present charter confirmed, to Walter of Flockton and his heirs, for his homage and service, all my wood, forest that is, I guess, unless it means literally wood, presume it means woods though, in his forest, wood in the Ville of Denby, without any reservation, to have and to hold to him and his heirs, of me, which means from me in a way, and my heirs, by hereditary right, freely and quietly, wholly, fully, with all liberties and easements pertaining to the aforesaid wood. Okay, where were we? Freely and quietly, wholly and fully, with all liberties and easements pertaining to the aforesaid wood, rendering thence annually to me and my heirs 1 silver penny on the day of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, for all secular service, exaction and demand, both foreign service of the Lord King and other service. And verily I and my heirs will warrant and defend against all people the aforesaid wood to the aforesaid Walter and his heirs forever. These being witnesses, John de Mitten, Robert de Linton, ... and others. Okay, this is a fairly kind of typical later charter with some things that we don't have here. For those of you who've got and remember reading through this one last week, can we spot any significant differences first? What differences can we notice between these two documents? I mean, they're both in English, but they've been translated from Latin, so they might translate the same phrases slightly differently. I don't mean let's pick up on individual words, but the broad sweep, the general content of these two charters. What can we see there which may or may not be different in terms of, say, the people involved or whatever? In fact, we can pass one of these to Altai since he doesn't have one.
The one we looked at before was giving lands to the church.
Right.
This is between 2 nobles.
Yeah, okay, or 2 sort of wealthy men or something like that. Okay.
There's the mention of
Yeah, okay, at the end we've got things like the warranty clause and a few other things and a specification about the services and so on, which we didn't have in the early one. Some kind of things come in a bit more later. That's one of the ways that people can date charters and so on. But picking up firstly on what Cengiz says, okay, the first one, the one we looked at on Tuesday, is a donation by a nobleman, William Peveril, giving something to a church. Okay, In contrast, this one is between two secular people, okay, and his heirs. Now you might say, well, that's not a big deal, okay, it's just a different people. But in fact, it's quite important because in many cases we have the original documents, we have the original pieces of parchment. They're often only about this big, on which these kind of charters are written. But I'd suspect that the majority of charters have been lost. These little things have been destroyed. And what happened is, in many churches in the Middle Ages, in the big churches, the monasteries particularly and so on, they noticed that their collections of these little charters are getting damaged or eaten by insects and so on. So they said, let's copy them all up in one way or another into a book to keep them more carefully preserved. It's easier to put them all together rather than have lots of separate pieces. So they put them all together as a cartulary, okay? And then, in many cases deliberately or subsequently accidentally, the originals were lost. And all we have are the copies put into a big book, often very thick manuscript, and we've lost the originals. And this is particularly what we see monasteries, churches doing. Now what happens there is, various things go on. What's the first thing that can happen if you're copying something? Well, yeah, I mean, you can make mistakes, okay? The first thing is that you make mistakes, and medieval scribes...
Unintentionally and maybe intentionally.
Yeah, that's the next one. Firstly, we'll think about the unintentional. People will jump lines, they'll jump from one word that looks similar to another similar word, miss out the bits in between, misread things or whatever. So mistakes can get introduced at any stage of copying, and this is true whether you're doing kind of medieval English history or ancient history, or whether you're looking at Ottoman history or something. Okay, copying always is a dangerous thing. Even on the web today, we can still make mistakes and so on. Intentional, however, is very important as well, as Özge has brought up. So they're not really mistakes as changes and so on. I mean, for example, here I am, I'm the abbot of somewhere or other, and I say, oh, we want to make sure we've got a good record of all the lands we have, because they bring in money and food to us and so on. And they say, okay, here's the list. So, and I say, wait a minute, why isn't this little town or village on the list? Oh, we couldn't find the charter, it must have been lost or something. So I say, okay, make one up. No one know the difference. They all have the same words, just put in a different name. It was this guy, I think, and we'll put in the place and so on. So they will actually have complete fabrications in some cases. Once or twice, it may just be kind of like the example I gave, where they're just trying to make up what's the reality. But in other cases, of course, they can deliberately forge charters to make claims that perhaps they're making now but have no basis in truth before. So we have to be very careful. If we don't have the originals, if we have these cartularies, we have to read them quite carefully for a number of levels of changes that might get introduced and so on. Some of them are quite small, others are very big, and some are complete fabrications and so on and things like that.
What about the third of it that the court kept up?
Oh, that's different. That's for these simple charters, we don't have that. No, they don't have that format. Okay, that's for the fines, as we said the other day, where they keep. They did have something in the Anglo-Saxon times that carries on to the post-Anglo-Saxon period, where they would make two copies because there's two people involved, and then they would write the word chirograph, okay, which is Christ, okay, and then graphum, and then they would cut across it. And again, the same idea is that only the two original copies would fit together, just as the feet thing or whatever would only be the original. So there were ways to try and kind of legitimize or authenticate charters even earlier on. But in most cases, we just have the single document with the little seal attached or lost and things like this. But then when the originals get damaged, of these ones, and there's no copy in the courts for this kind of thing, they end up being copied into the cartulary and changed and things. And these are relating to the earlier period. When we get into the period where we get lots of fines, the situation is a bit different, and that's usually, a lot of that's between people rather than between churches and a person and things like that. Okay, the other one was, because what were they doing? They were giving the land to the church in return for what? Remember, no such thing as a free lunch, as we said. What are they getting in return there?
It was a small monetary, but mostly for the church praying for them.
Yeah, it was in free alms, but the assumption would be perhaps that there would be some kind of religious payment in a sense or whatever. But this one is not like that. What's going on here? What are the returns in this one? Two things we should notice. Homage and service. Okay, so this is a feudal thing. Okay, this is the lord and his vassal in effect. And what else? The bit that I've in fact underlined for some reason in the original photocopy, and they've put a little star there to discuss the word rendering. Yeah, rendering thence annually to me, every year to me and my heirs, 1 silver penny on the day of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So once a year, this Walter de Flockton or his heirs has to pay to Adam or to his heirs a silver penny. Okay, so it's a kind of a rent or a kind of an ongoing payment or something like that. I forgot what the Turkish word is. When you go and buy something, if I'm buying something big, they say, oh, hocam, is it nakit? Or is it, what's the other one where you pay the taxi or whatever? And I usually go for nakit, just get it out of the way and things, because I'm amazingly rich anyway, so I don't worry about that. But so this is a kind of taxi kind of thing, although that's not quite the right application to a different context and so on. So we can see here two very different kinds of transaction. One which is between a man and a religious institution, and that has certain implications. And this one here between two laymen, and it basically involves a money exchange for this wood or whatever. But we can have plenty of cases where someone is selling land to a church. It doesn't mean that they only expect praying and things. We do get monetary payments involved with churches as well.
Why would they even ask for that? It's not a lot.
What?
1 silver penny once a year. Why would you even...
But it'll add up. I mean, silver is worth a fair bit, so it's not a massive amount. But then he's got more stuff anyway. But that's a fair question. Sometimes they say 3 times a year, and they specify which religious days these payments have to be made. But these people are getting lots of things coming in at different points in the year. It all adds up, I suppose. What about the witness list here? Remember, we talked about witnesses on Tuesday. Their function was what? What was the function of witnesses? Yes, I mean, in theory, if someone would challenge and say, no, this man doesn't have that wood, then if those people are still alive, they could be in theory called upon to say, I witnessed this, I was somehow there at the transaction, or at least I agreed to this if I was not physically there, and their names are given. So in the one that we had here, okay, we have the full list of people: Robert, son of Helgot, Robert, son of Warner, Ingelram, brother of the sheriff, Peter, de Sandy, Yakur, etc., etc. Okay, and it carries on to the end. Here, and I'm not very sure what's gone on in this kind of translation, we've got the ... But this is a good example of, like I said the other day, where people, often in the cartularies, because we're talking 100, 150 years later, they think, we don't need to copy all these stupid names down because these guys had died years ago anyway. So then they put and others et aliis in Latin or whatever. Sometimes they have that anyway. After a long list of names, they say, and there were others. But occasionally they might just give the first few names and then leave it kind of blank or whatever, which obviously annoys the historians because we like to see these people and we like to find out who's connected to whom and so on. And we said here we have the warranty clause, okay. Verily I and my heirs will warrant, will guarantee and defend against all people who will challenge this, the aforesaid wood, to the aforesaid Walter and his heirs forever. So they're adding this little extra thing which in itself doesn't amount to very much, but to say that we are guaranteeing that this transaction has happened and so on. Okay, let's quickly have a look at Wales. I just wanted to say a few little things about my homeland during this time, just to kind of follow up what we've said before with reference to Ireland in some ways. So I may have shown this map before, but I'll put it into a slightly bigger picture here. Now you remember with what happens during Henry's reign with Ireland is that, as Altais mentioned again in his presentation, you get Diarmaid mac Murrough coming because of his problems at home in Ireland and requesting Henry's help, and then that kind of sets the ball rolling. And initially a bunch of Anglo-Norman guys, Welsh Norman guys, Cambro-Norman guys kind of move in to kind of help, but to also get a few things for themselves. Now what's happening in Wales, or what happens in Wales during the Normans and into the Angevin time, is kind of similar but a bit different as well. Now we have kind of two main sides of the coin. We think about sort of South Wales and North Wales in particular, and just to remind ourselves, we talk often in North Wales particularly about the kingdom of Gwynedd, which is the biggest and most powerful kingdom in the north, and what had been Dyfed and is now often referred to as Deheubarth, which is a slightly larger area in the southwest. And then we've got these other regions along here, which are to some extent separate. This is the very early map showing incursions by different gangs of Normans, in a sense, into parts of Wales. What happened in the north was that a guy called Robert, and he gets the nickname of Rhuddlan, this is place here, who was cousin of the Earl of Chester, who was a very powerful magnate. They begin pressing along the north coast, slowly moving this way, during the 1070s and so on. And by the time of Domesday Book, which is when, and remember what year Domesday Book is? Can you cast your minds back a couple of weeks? 1086 to 7, we will say, okay? So by 1086, okay, Robert is said to be paying £40, which in that time is quite a lot, to go back to your earlier question about one silver penny and so on, £40 a year to the king for kind of lordship in North Wales, whatever. This area, which is more or less the region I come from, had been kind of incorporated into Cheshire, the Shire of Cheshire, so it was effectively part of England at that point. But this region over here had come under Robert's rule, and looks as if it's going to go that way. Okay, and the main claimant to the kingship, the Welsh claimant to the kingship of Gwynedd, was in prison, I think at that time or whatever. In the south, Deheubarth in 1086 was controlled by a guy called Rhys, and he also paid £40 to William. So he's kind of acknowledging William's overlordship. So you have a Norman guy up here, and you have a Welshman in the south paying for their part. The big year for the Welsh situation is 1093, kind of 1093 to 4, I suppose. In this year, Robert of Rhuddlan is killed, possibly by the guy who claims to be king of Gwynedd, and so the whole kind of thing falls apart there, and then the native Welsh are re-established in North Wales. So what looks like the more or less takeover of North Wales by the English or the Normans falls apart at that point, okay, and the Welsh reassert themselves, apart from my little region up in the northeast here, which is still kind of debated. But the independent ruler Rhys in Deheubarth is killed, possibly by Normans, and that more or less then opens up the floodgates, opens up the doors for any kind of Norman adventurer and nobleman to stake his claim and to make a push into Wales. So we get people moving into this region here, Morgannwg, and creating the lordship of Glamorgan. Okay, we get the movement down to this part of Deheubarth and eventually becoming Pembrokeshire, okay, based on the castle at Pembroke there. We get the movement into the kingdom of Brycheiniog, and that creates the lordship of Brecknock, or Brecon as it's called there. And then for a while the region of Ceredigion is conquered as well. This becomes Cardiganshire, although that gets taken back by the Welsh later on. So whereas the north kind of reasserts itself, the south within the decade or so after 1093 begins to become more and more into under Norman control. So here's a nice map that I've written on as well. which kind of shows the situation. Ah, look, and here, because we have a castle there, there is my village, okay? There is, in fact, my village where I come from. What this shows is the regions directly controlled in one way or another by the Normans, which are marked out by these very dark lines. Okay. And then again here you see. And then the dotted line is the area that periodically they control. So you see Ceredigion, which is kind of this area here, disappears. We've got this small Cardigan region there, so we don't have a massive lordship there anymore, and so on. There was a region of Bilth that for a while was Norman as well. Now we talk about there's two ways of talking about this. This kind of border like that is usually called the Welsh March, and that means it's the kind of border area and overlapping on some of the land goes on into Wales, some of it goes into England, and these were controlled to a large extent by noblemen who, particularly in Wales, if they'd conquered the territory, they regarded it as theirs. And it was a kind of buffer zone between England and Wales, and there was a certain level of independence in this march area, in a sense. And some rebels against the king could go to the march and so on. Some of the shires, particularly Pembrokeshire, okay, becomes integrated into the English system, even though it's physically separate from the English shires, and it was administered by the royal government and so on. And in the meantime, here what remains of the kingdom of Deheubarth and then the kingdom of Gwynedd continue to be relatively independent. Okay, during the period of the later Norman kings and Henry, we see a pattern set up whereby these guys, when there is a strong king, like when there is Henry, they recognise the English king as their overlord, and they will accept it. But during periods such as Stephen's anarchy, you get Welsh revolts. Okay, Stephen's reign, 1135, there was a big Welsh revolt in 1136. They made the most of that. And then when the English can come in and kind of reassert themselves and say, no, you've been bad boys, then the Welsh say, oh yes, sorry, we recognise you as overlord, and so on. And it carries on for a few more decades. Then there's another kind of revolt, and they make more gains. And it kind of more or less carries on like that until the reign of Edward the First, who we'll talk about in the last class, who effectively conquers Wales and asserts it as part of English territory in a sense. So the difference is that, well, the similarity to Ireland is that we get the kind of march and we get these semi-independent lordships being set up by Anglo-Norman noblemen and warriors and so on. We don't really get the concept of the Lord of Wales. The English king Henry will claim to be overlord over the Welsh kings, but he doesn't claim to be Lord of Wales. So he doesn't have a claim there, which is why, for example, we get a different way of indicating these territories in a sense, because there's a different situation going on there. And that's quite important. And by the later period, we cease to talk about these Welsh kings as kings, and we talk about them as princes. Okay? And the rulers in Gwynedd assume, well, in Latin, princeps means the principal ruler. Okay? So it means the top guy. There are all these kings, but I'm the principal one. I'm the princeps of the kings, which then leads to the English word, okay, or French word prince that we have in English now. And of course that's why even today the heir to the English throne is the Prince of Wales. Okay, so again, if we went back in time and compared present situation with the past people will be kind of surprised, but someone like Owain Gwynedd, who saw himself as a great prince and so on of Wales, would have certainly been a bit surprised if he knew that the English king's son had that title and so on. But historically that's what happens later on and so on. Okay, right, let's stop there. So Zainab wanted to leave 10 minutes early. We've just given you 3 minutes before 10 minutes, so we'll stop there. So I need to contact Marta, find out that she's alive, primarily, and secondly, if she's okay for next week, and then we need to work out what she's doing and what I can do and things like that. Okay, have a nice weekend, everyone. See you all next week.